So, if you had a prac student, what would you expect from them and what would you do as their supervisor to mentor them?
Sure. So I've had the joy of supervising a lot of student teachers in the past. It's one of my favourite things to do, actually. Not just because I feel a responsibility. Every teacher has learned from all of the teachers who mentored them, the teachers they had when they were a student. You could never really repay that debt. So it's like, oh, okay, I should pay that forward. So I think that's important. I think every teacher should consider doing it. But also because, and I've seen this working with you guys, that I learn a lot from seeing, I'm 15 years out of uni now. I'm really old. And there's a lot of things have changed. I use Desmos almost every day now when I'm exploring functions and graphing. And that didn't exist when I went through my teacher training. And there's X number of things that have happened like that, which get those ideas. So I love doing this. I feel like there were two questions there. What am I expecting? And then what will I do? So the first thing is, very, very simply, I expect a student teacher, someone who's learning their craft and all that kind of thing, to work really hard. Boy, teaching is difficult. And I think sometimes we go into things, and I remember thinking this somewhat in the past, I learned this thing, I'm going in to teach a year 7 lesson on fractions. I know fractions. How hard can this be to explain this fairly rudimentary concept? And I can see you're kind of smiling because I've seen how difficult it can be, right? So I expect a prac teacher to work really hard to understand what's the clearest way, what's a clear way to explain this, what misconceptions might come up in my students that I can try and anticipate and respond to, and also to be able to have thought through a concept and the activities and tasks that will help a student develop their understanding of that, to have really sweated the details on that. It might go terribly, and that's fine, that's part of the learning process. But if it goes terribly because you didn't think it through, it's you're not going to learn very much about it. It's when you really put yourself into it, I thought I had a really great lesson for this. It didn't end up, you get to test your assumptions because it didn't end up the way you thought, right? So that's kind of, I guess, the essence of what I expect. And then we could talk about knowledge of the subject and classroom management and all that, but I feel like all of those fit underneath that one big work hard at your craft, right? That's what I expect. All the learning comes along the way. Maybe that's the other thing, to be responsive to feedback. When you teach a lesson, especially when you've put a lot of effort into it, if you get critical feedback, it feels like, sometimes it is, but sometimes it feels like it's a statement about you as a person. You take it personally, right? And we'll never grow as teachers if we can't have some separation and say, okay, please be brutal, tell me what I can do better. One of the most enduring things, not just for student teachers, but for anyone who's an educator, is I think I know the way things should be done this way. I've been teaching for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, I don't need to change this, right? That's a really dangerous attitude. So that willingness to change is important. And then lastly, what do I provide? I think the thing that I want to try and do most is ask lots of questions, where did you get this in the syllabus? Why do you think this is an important thing to, sort of emphasize in the classroom? Why would you spend this amount of time on this and leave this amount of time for that? Is that really the best way to go? How do you think, this student in the class will respond to this versus that student? I think as I've gotten better at teaching and gotten more experience, asking the right questions is what I've learned to do better. I think in terms of my knowledge has somewhat stayed stable, but I have a better sense for what I should be focusing on, what questions I should be asking. And then all the usual, duty of care. I am here to be responsible for the students in my classroom, and also to know, as a student teacher being fresh to things, you should feel like you can take risks, and that at any point you're oh no, this is not going to plan, I'm just going to pull the parachute. It's part of why I'm there in the classroom as well. So those are the things which I think provide a supportive environment.
Similar question, but a bit off topic. What if not a prac student that you might have, but as a prac student, if you get a teacher who isn't that supportive? I've had a friend who was doing the course and did their first prac about a couple of months ago, and had a teacher that wasn't supportive of them and was very much throw them in the deep end, let them drown before they come and rescue them, and wasn't supportive in helping them to get the best out of teaching.
Yeah.
What would your advice to those students be?
So I'm so glad you asked that question. It is really important to wrestle with that reality because it's real. It does happen, and there's such a diversity in the teaching population that in some ways we should kind of expect, sadly, that will happen. You have multiple, that's one of the reasons why we have multiple pracs, that, even if you have that experience, you'll have other opportunities. Very practically, what do you do? Thought number one, I remember being told this by my tertiary supervisor, the person who worked at the university, who's managing us and visiting and all that. And she said, you will learn something from every teacher that you interact with. Sometimes you will learn by counterexample. You're like, that's not what I'm going to do. But it's important that you learn that lesson, right? And reflect, like, okay, this teacher's not doing, like, perhaps they can't control the classroom and actually get their students on task. They're not explaining in a way, like, you can see the students are very confused and what's going on there. To be able to ask the question, to observe that and then to ask the question, but why is that happening? Because sometimes a teacher is not effective but doesn't even necessarily know themselves or can't articulate why that is. So to think about that carefully is very important. That's one side. Secondly, the reason why I was talking to my tertiary supervisor is you shouldn't just let that go. Sometimes, things happen in supervision of prac teachers that absolutely shouldn't happen. Don't feel like you should say, I guess this is going to be the way it is. Like, raise that. That's why we have tertiary supervisors and that kind of thing. You can also have conversations with other people within the school and say, hey, is this appropriate? I've been left in the classroom by myself and I feel like this shouldn't be happening. And to pose those questions, and it's not comfortable, but super important because we have a really important job. So making sure it's done well is important. I think that's a practical couple of ways for that.
I think that's great.